First of all, I'd like to start this video off by saying happy birthday, Withered Circle, one of the best theorists inside of this community. He's currently doing a live stream with a few other members, going over them solving Midnight Motorist, so I thought I'd toss my hat into the ring. You guys have known what my interpretation of Midnight Motorist is, but for those of you who don't, I wanted to catch you up a little bit, let you know what I think about Midnight Motorist, especially considering I just got into a bit of a bigger fight about it on Twitter, so I thought I'd just lay down everything that I know about this silly little minigame. As you guys know, a lot of people don't actually know how to solve the minigame, but, you know, we can try our best with the piece of information we've been given. Thanks to 5 Laps at Freddy's, we do know that the orange man is intended to be William Afton, and with that, we can somehow put together the pieces that we've been seeing. We know that there are 2 family members, one of them being presumably the purple or the orange man's son, and we know that he's driving away from a crime scene, thanks to the Midnight Motor description. So with that being said, let's actually break down what Midnight Motorist is. In Five Nights at Freddy's 6, you can grab an arcade machine called Midnight Motorist, which is essentially a little minigame in which you're on a 4-lane highway, driving fast down in the pouring rain, and trying not to hit the other cars. However, if you manage to hit a exit from one of the roads, you end up entering something called the Later That Night minigame, in which the purple car, something we've already seen associated with William Afton thanks to the Take Cake to the Children minigame, ends up driving down to a bar called Junior's, which is nearby his house. After being told that he can't come back in, suggesting that he's already been kicked out, possibly suggesting that he is currently intoxicated, he ends up driving away. Now, this isn't an intended path, rather something hidden that we can find, but by going to the left, we can actually also find what's referred to as the mound, which is just this pile of dirt randomly in the middle of the woods. We don't actually know what this mound is, however, there are a lot of good theories out there as to what it is referring to, and it's pretty safe to say that considering this is a hidden part of the minigame, that Afton likely didn't come here, and that it's important to solving what the Midnight Motorist minigame actually is. Afton then gets back into his car, goes all the way down to his house, which is in the middle of the woods, with a bunch of bushes all around it, and it's fairly secluded. The reason why this is important is because I actually think we've seen this house before, which we'll get into here in a minute. But when we continue the minigame, he goes inside, he sees someone sitting down inside of a chair watching TV. That person then tells him to leave him alone tonight. He's been through a lot today. In which, William ends up going to the room at the end of the house, ends up banging on the door, saying, "Hey, open up, this is my house, you can't lock the door on me." He goes to walk away, but then gets even more angry and just slams on the door and says, "Open it up, open the door." He then makes his way outside and around to try and see if he can get in through the window, only to find the window is broken, seeing footsteps out there in the middle of the woods, and little footsteps, the child running off to follow the big footsteps of what's presumably an animatronic. Now, this animatronic has to have 3 toes, which means that it has to match either a Springlock character like Fredbear Spring Bonnie, or one of the main characters from the classic suits, Freddy, Bonnie, Chica, and Foxy. It could also be the withered animatronics like Shadow Freddy. Now, we wouldn't have really known a lot about this if it weren't for some people going back and looking at older games, as well as some more recent games that came out, most notably Help Wanted's Curse of Dreadbear DLC, which ends up finding us in the middle of the woods during October, in which we can see the FNAF 4 house out there inside of the distance, presumably this being the Afton's house during that time. It's the same exact house from the FNAF 4 menu screen. But if you actually pay attention to the FNAF 4 menu screen, we can actually see the animatronics, or at least their shadows, luring inside of the bushes. Almost like the same exact thing has already occurred before, that this is being inspired by an event that whoever this runaway has seen before. However, because of these connections, since, you know, it's the FNAF 4 menu house, a lot of people think, oh, FNAF 4 house, so that must mean that the minigames take place around Halloween. That being because of the Halloween update that would end up releasing later that year, which would end up showing a version of the FNAF 4 minigames with Halloween decorations. However, this isn't really intended to be a canonical piece of evidence, despite some people attempting to use it as such, because although the characters do very much wear their short sleeves during an event that's presumably during Halloween, a lot of people forget that these decoys, or the decorations, this isn't the first time that they've been used. This has been used in FNAF 1, which takes place in November, which realistically Michael can't work there in October because someone else is working that shift. It's improbable. FNAF 2 also shows these same exact similar decorations with a pumpkin casually chilling on the thing, but that doesn't magically make the events of FNAF 2 take place during October, because they physically can't. We're told that the events of FNAF 2 take place during a short period of weeks, and the location doesn't open up until a week before the event of Five Nights at Freddy's 2, which is in November, which means, again, it's improbable to say that this was an event happening on Halloween. Five Nights at Freddy's 3 is the only thing that gets kind of a pass here, because although Halloween is supposedly the next week during Five Nights at Freddy's 3, it's not too weird to have Halloween decorations up during the events of Five Nights at Freddy's 3. But still, because of the way that FNAF 1 and FNAF 2 work, it doesn't make it plausible that suddenly FNAF 4 can be possible during the events of Halloween. At the end of the day, Bite Victim has a birthday. It's not something that can just be changed around depending on when we throw decorations on. If there was just a Christmas edition as well and put Christmas items everywhere, that wouldn't magically make the Bite Victim's birthday happen in Christmas. It's just intended to be decoration for the event. It's not intended to be a very serious piece of information. So was Bite Victim's birthday on Halloween or near Halloween? Probably not. When we actually look at the FNAF 4 minigame, we actually get some pretty good pieces of evidence for when it could be taking place. And that's most notably the two houses problem. A lot of people like to ignore it, but the fact is, the Midnight Motorist house in the FNAF 4 menu house is not the same exact house that we see in the FNAF 4 minigames. The FNAF 4 minigame house is specifically in a neighborhood where there is a road and sidewalk and children playing at the park nearby. This is a completely different house from the FNAF 4 or menu house in the Midnight Motorist house, which are distinctly out in the middle of the woods, secluded from everybody else. They are fairly clearly different houses, placing these at different time periods, suggesting there was something that motivated the Aftons to move from one house to the other. You can also pay attention to basic storytelling of all of the characters having short sleeve shirts and wearing shorts, and grass being all fresh and green, and flowers blooming. That places the events of Five Nights at Freddy's 4's minigames from late spring all the way till early fall, which doesn't include Halloween. Halloween is not considered early fall. That would still be months away from the events of Halloween, always placing Bite Victim's death before the events of Halloween. To me, that places Midnight Motorist, considering the two different houses, either before or after the events of FNAF 4, and considering that Midnight Motorist is connected, or the FNAF 4 house is connected to Curse of Dreadbear, which is during Halloween, it heavily suggests the events of the FNAF 4 gameplay, the FNAF 4 menu house, Midnight Motorist, all to take place after the events of Five Nights at Freddy's 4. It's improbable to assume that this is taking place before the events of Five Nights at Freddy's 4. Which then gives us a pretty good motivation as to why Afton moved in the first place. Fredbear's was shut down after the bite of 83. There would be no reason to still live near Fredbear's family diner. In fact, he would probably want to stay as far away from them as he physically could, especially considering that his house is fairly close to the Fall Fest grounds. It could potentially suggest that that's why he moved there, because now with Fredbear's down, he had to move closer to the Fall Fest, something that he was personally spending his time working on after Fredbear's was shut down. It makes the most sense, which then would make Midnight Motorist an epilogue to the events of Five Nights at Freddy's 4. And if that's the case, then we kind of got a pretty good understanding of what's going on here. Obviously, Bite Victim already has to be dead at this point, which means the mound is most likely Bite Victim's body. This is too early for it to be Elizabeth's or anyone else's body. It has to be Bite Victim's. It then explains why Shadow Freddy or Golden Freddy, one of these two characters, could potentially be the one standing outside of the runaway's window, that being Mike, because they're both directly connected to Bite Victim's death. I understand that some people like to interpret that Shadow Freddy is just William's wickedness pure, but that completely discounts the existence of Nightmare, who is told to us to be the fearful reflection of what Afton has created, Shadow Bonnie, and the multiple other shadow animatronics we've seen over the years, XOR, the characters in the Happiest Day minigames. There is not a singular shadow animatronic. Shadow Freddy is not everything of William. Shadow Freddy is specifically tied to specific events that William does, one of those events being the shattering of Bite Victim. It's why Nightmare doesn't appear until after the birthday, because it is specifically tied to what happened after the bite. It's specifically tied to the pieces of Bite Victim being ripped apart, to him being broken. That's what results in the Shadow Freddy. Otherwise, you're ignoring every other piece of evidence that heavily suggests that Shadow Freddy is tied to Bite Victim. It has no connection to Charlie, has no connection to any other character but William and Bite Victim. Those are the only two characters that Shadow Freddy is tied to. So, with that kind of information, we can assume that Shadow Freddy or Golden Freddy are the people reaching out to Michael and taking him to the mound, which then leads into the FNAF 4 gameplay, in which William decides he's going to punish Michael by putting him inside of the experiment chambers. Mind you, this doesn't imply that the experiment chambers are based off what happened to Charlie. It's 100% that the experiment chambers are based off what happened to Bite Victim. That after all of these months that have been since the Bite Victim was bitten, William built and constructed the experiments so that way he would be able to test and try and replicate what happened to Bite Victim. Charlie was not an intended, she was more so the result of him being angry at Henry after potentially the Fall Fest fire. That makes the most sense for why he would end up lashing out. His creations got destroyed, so he lashed out by destroying something of Henry's creation. But of course, it could just be that he attacked Charlie, similar in the books, just out of jealousy. Either way, that's the reason why William kills her. It has nothing really to do with experimentation. The experimentation is directly tied to Bite Victim's death, hence why it's always replicating Bite Victim's death, not Charlie's death. And that's when things kind of start to be put in place. It would kind of suggest, the Later That Night title, along with the rain and driving away being connected to Take Cake and the security puppet minigame, that the night of Halloween, when this is taking place, according to Curse of Dreadbear, which is a Halloween event, which is heavily connected to the FNAF 4 gameplay, as well as the Midnight Motorist minigame, it suggests that Charlie died on Halloween, that she was killed during the before Midnight Motorist, leading into Midnight Motorist. The 1987 dice that we see in 5 Laps at Freddy's, it was never intended to suggest that Midnight Motorist is in 1987. It was intended to suggest a connection to the puppet and the Take Cake minigame, which exists in 1987. It all fits perfectly together and makes a lot of sense. You then also have details like the FNAF 4 release dates, in which FNAF 4, the original game, releases in the summer of 2015. And yet the Halloween update, which would introduce the character of Nightmare, which is considered a non-canon event version of the game, as in Bite Victim and Mike would have never seen these characters in his own dreams, introduces Nightmare on Halloween, the fearful reflection of what he's created. This is flat out confirming that Charlie is tied to Halloween, and that her death is what created the Nightmare. Not only this, but specifically she takes the spot of Nightmare in this version of the game mode. The two deaths we see take place in 1983, Nightmare being tied to the Bite Victim's death, and Nightmare being tied to Charlie's death. They aren't the same exact creature, they're just both the result of an event that took place in 1983, hence why they take each other's place. So in conclusion, the most simple interpretation of Midnight Motorist is when you put the pieces together. You have the FNAF 4 minigames. Bite victim gets bitten, ends up creating either the Shadow Freddy or leading Golden Freddy to teleport outside of Mike's window. He's the runaway. He ends up running out to where Bite Victim is buried, until Halloween, in which something happens, or William's anger just gets the best of him, he's being drunk and all that, and he ends up going to kill Charlie, in which when he returns home, he ends up shoving Micheal inside of the experiment chambers, also angry at the fact that he just keeps running off and disrespecting William like that. It makes the most sense. It then directly connects to why FNAF 4 has the characters looming outside of Michael's window, because it's directly connected to the inciting event that made him go to the nightmare chambers, that being Midnight Motorist. It all fits together perfectly fine. It makes the most sense, without complicating it with all of the, well, the gray shirt guy is fairly clearly Micheal, because Micheal is the only person on Earth who's ever watched TV and worn a gray shirt. Of course. It just gets kind of pointless if you start trying to play that game, because you're going to be fairly nitpicky and not find a satisfying answer, because you are overcomplicating the series and trying to find a pattern that doesn't exist. So, with that being said, I'll leave you guys to think whatever you want to believe, but this is my simple interpretation of Midnight Motorist. There are more details, of course, as I stated. I think it's possible that William ended up getting angry and killing Charlie because of the Fall Fest fire, which is why Curse of Dreadbear is directly connected to the events of Midnight Motorist. That is all happening on the same night. That the Fall Fest fire, Midnight Motorist, and all these events are happening on Halloween. Bite Victim's already dead. We're shown that with Curse of Dreadbear being a character who's already dead and coming back to life. I think that's more so it is basically telling you outright what Midnight Motorist is. It is Bite Victim in Golden Freddy reaching out, coming back from the dead, reaching out to Micheal. That is the purpose of the Dreadbear connection. But what do I know? I'm just a theorist, and this was just a theory. Let me know what you guys think in the comments down below. Continue believing what you're going to believe, but I would highly suggest you take some pieces of information I've mentioned here into consideration. And again, happy birthday to Withered Circle. Go watch that stream. I'll leave it linked at the end of this video and in the description. And I'll see you guys all again soon. Matane.